Hello and welcome, everyone. My name's Pablo Berrutti. I'm the Managing Director of Altiorem, and I'm very delighted today to be able to welcome you to our discussion around misconceptions and for sustainable finance in emerging and developing economies. I'm joined by two excellent guests in Carlos Vargas and Maheen Rahman, and we're also going to hopefully have Abinash join us shortly from IPE. They'll introduce themselves in just a moment. Unfortunately, Anjali from the Asian Investor Group of Climate Change had a personal issue and is not able to join us today, but it allows us to then have a lot more time with our other three excellent speakers. And so just to give you a little bit of a preface as to why we're here and why we're having this conversation. So Altiorem, for those of you who don't know, is a community-built sustainable finance library. We operate a bit like Wikipedia, where we have relationships with universities and finance industry professionals who collect, curate, categorize and summarize sustainable research that's relevant to sustainable finance and house it in the Altiorem library, which is free for everyone to use and join when they join. Now, one of the advantages of having a library such as that is that you get to see where there are gaps or where there are issues that are perhaps not getting the attention that they deserve. And one of the things that occurred to us when we looked through the resources, there's sort of 400 odd research summaries plus organizations that are profiled in the Altiorem library, is that most of the discussion around developing economies is happening by researchers, well-meaning for sure, in developed countries or in wealthier countries who are sort of talking about the developing economies as opposed to hearing from them directly. And we thought, well, that's something that we ought to address, and we should actually start to spend a bit more time thinking about what are the stories on the ground, what are the issues that are being faced at the front lines in these countries, because of course many of these countries not only hold the keys to the solutions to for things like achieving the Paris Agreement, but they're also suffering the greatest effects from the climate that's already changed. And so the balancing of trying to understand the right ways to be able to help and the ways to promote sustainable human development in that context is incredibly important. And so in the spirit of doing that, I am not going to say any more for now. I'll be asking some questions along the way just to keep the conversation going. But to start, I just want to, one very important thing that I should do before we kick off is acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I'm coming to you from. So it's the Gadigal people. I'm in the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I think if we are perhaps to learn some lessons from our failure to listen to the incredible culture that has existed, or cultures, many cultures that have existed here in Australia for the last 60,000 years, and learn about sustainability from people that can actually can do that extraordinary length of the oldest culture in the world. We should actually learn those lessons and start to listen more. So let's do that today. So I'm going to open just by asking Carlos and Maheen to introduce themselves briefly and their backgrounds, and to give us one or two of the misconceptions or barriers that they see in their work that is really holding back the ability for sustainable finance to play its fullest role. So I will start with Carlos. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Pablo, and thank you, Mariana, for this very, very kind invitation. I also think I should pay my respects as well, coming from a country like Mexico with all of these very, very profound background of people that have lived in the area for thousands of years, and all of that actually is very much intermingled to what the Mexican culture is as such. I feel very lucky to be today talking to you from Australia. I have been visiting University of Melbourne for the last 2 weeks, and it's my honor to try to give you an idea of what those misconceptions regarding sustainable finance are for my region. I think one very important element that we find in Latin America is precisely the cultural barriers that we find regarding this topic. There's a lot of misunderstanding of how much could be achieved with sustainable finance, but also regarding the part where we also understand it sometimes as a cost and not as an investment, and the different things that are entitled to be taken in order to be more effective in sustainable finance implementation, well, sometimes are seen as a burden. That perhaps comes from well, different sources, obviously, but mostly because of inadequate management of some of the financial sector for many years, for example, and also being culturally not so trusty about new ideas or a little bit resistant to change. On the more practical sense, I think also a lot of what influences those obstacles for sustainable finance in the region are also related to ambiguity in regulation. In the case of Latin America, we sometimes have a very complicated time, and perhaps that's also the case in other areas in the world, into trying to align regulation within different departments of government, trying to understand how the tax ministry should be aligning with the environmental ministry and some others. And in the case of sustainable finance, we actually touch on different areas of this more traditional structure of government, and that also has represented some work and some challenge to this point. Another important element, perhaps I could also say, and it's much related to all of that, is high initial investment cost. In the case of Latin America, availability of resources is sometimes much more limited than it would be for other more developed countries. And in the case of those initial investments that are required sometimes to start to trigger some of these new initiatives, it does make it a little bit complicated at the very beginning. Having said that, well, there's a lot of interest and awareness about sustainable finance in the region. There's a lot of things happening as we speak. Countries like Mexico have already started issuing green bonds for some years now, both in the sovereign and a private area, for example. And also there's a lot of very interesting efforts and ambitions into trying to tackle climate change by the introduction of taxonomies in the Latin American region. We have a very brand new taxonomy in Mexico, for example, for the last 2 months, one in Colombia for the last year, and several others under development, particularly in Chile and Brazil, to be forthcoming very soon, but also in other Caribbean and Latin American countries that are also trying to go ahead and do their first steps into trying to take not only the challenges that we were mentioning, but actually trying to find opportunities into sustainable finance.
That's a great way to open, Carlos. Thank you, and it really gives us a fantastic canvas to start to paint with our conversation as we go forward. So I'm going to turn now to Maheen. Maheen, if you just introduce yourself and give us some of your perspectives on the misconceptions, but also the barriers and how we might resolve them. Thank you.
Sure, thank you, and thank you, Pablo, for having me on this discussion. It is quite by chance that I happen to be in Australia at the moment, so it's really nice to join this conversation. By way of introduction, my name is Maheen Rahman. I'm the Chief Executive at Infrazamin. Infrazamin is a credit enhancement company that looks at sustainable financing for infrastructure projects. And we work, we're sort of owned by the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which is based out of the UK, which works across about 40 countries across Southeast Asia, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa to see how infrastructure financing can be done in a more sustainable way using more elements of private capital and more sort of innovative blended finance techniques to sort of enable financial close on sustainable infrastructure that the region obviously lacks. Now, in terms of my own experience on sort of what are the sort of practical barriers in terms of addressing how to go about doing something that's sustainable and also long-term and carries the impact that you need it to have. I think the biggest issue that we're seeing, along with sort of general sort of misunderstanding around what ESG actually means or what health and safety actually means, but I think is also project availability. Because while there is a huge demand and need for various types of infrastructure and various types of projects that can help mitigate and definitely adapt, help in adaptation towards climate events, there is a serious lack of actual projects to be able to be bankable and to be investable. And I think the key challenge then comes in how do we get the projects that we have in terms of pipeline and how do we bring them up to meet certain standards, particularly around sort of health and safety that we focus on, or governance, or even environmental impact. And so for us, really, the journey is very much around here's a project and how can we layer on the elements of impact and sustainability so that it actually meets sort of checks all the boxes in terms of how we can make it bankable and palatable for our investors and for ourselves as well. I think one of the other things also that we've seen a lot around climate, and we've worked extensively in Pakistan in trying to understand the flood situation that happened last year. And I think, more and more the focus that we're seeing is on mitigation, which is really related to sort of renewable energy, etc. Now, emerging markets will use renewable energy because it makes economic sense to do so, not because they're heavy carbon emitters and they want to cut carbon emissions. But adaptation, I believe, is still a little way behind in terms of how do we actually adapt or create projects that help countries such as Pakistan, which suffered immense damage in the floods, adapt to such situations or build infrastructure around, flood rehabilitation or then flood impact mitigation that would significantly help them going forward. I think also when we look at, Pakistan or other sort of emerging markets, it's really important to get stakeholders involved. And by stakeholders, I don't just mean sort of the project owners. I'm also referring to government regulators, the central banks, the local commercial banks, the local sort of pools of private capital that you find that really are needed to crowd in and help finance a lot of the sort of climate projects that we get. I think one of the biggest issue is really kind of connecting a project with the right investor. And what we find a lot of the time is that, private investors can be very risk averse, especially if it's a project that they don't fully understand, or it's something which requires new technology or carries more risk than what they have been used to. So that's an area that we've been trying to close by sort of using blended finance, either last stage sort of, early stage equity, or then even looking at risk transfer mechanisms, which is what Infrazamin does by using credit guarantees to make private sector investors more comfortable with the sort of risks of the project by transferring those risks onto our balance sheet as well. So, I mean, there's quite a lot of engagement and capacity building, I think, that needs to really happen in these markets for sustainable finance to be fully understood, and for project owners also to understand what actually constitutes the right elements of sustainability. Sometimes it's not enough to just build a solar plant, but what is going to be the impact of that plant on the local population? Will there be displacement? What will be the environmental impact in that local particular area? So, a lot of things that, we have to consider in this. So, having said that, I do think I'm quite positive about the future of climate finance and sustainable finance, simply because it's gathering so much attention, both locally as well as globally. And I think the real trick will be finding the right projects that are bankable and can be made investable for that to have long-term sort of impact going forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Maheen. There's some great areas for further discussion shortly. But Abinash, thank you for joining us as well today. We're just kicking off by a brief introduction of yourself and also areas that a couple of areas where you believe there are misconceptions around sustainable finance in developing economies and barriers and other issues, and then we can get into solutions after that. But please, over to you.
Thank you, Pablo. What up? I mean, it's a hard shoe to fill in after Carlos and Maheen coming here. But good morning from India and good evening wherever you are from and joining from which part of the world. So I'm Abinash. I'm primarily IPCC reviewer and the global head of climate change and sustainability for IP Global, which is an international development organization. I have been also working with Government of India as Center of Excellence Directors, but my work spans across understanding hazard, risk, and vulnerability, doing a lot of risk assessments and impacts to understand how the sectorial impacts and what are the financial implications that impact is going to have it. So let me start with numbers, since we have been talking about the need of the hour is about blended finance, is about sustainable finances, but numbers often don't lie. But numbers are also kind of provide a pattern. So let me start with what India has been trying to do and how the region has been panned across. Of course, Maheen touched upon some of this across the Southeast Asian region, how the financing, especially with the private enterprise, is panning out. But if you talk about the vulnerabilities, then India 75% or 3/4 of its districts are extreme event hotspots. And more importantly, their landscapes are kind of evolving because 40% of them are showcasing a swapping trend. Now, what does a swapping trend mean? A swapping trend means a traditional flood-prone area is becoming drought-prone area is becoming flood-prone, so on and so forth. And this is what is across South Asia and more importantly, very prominent across Southeast Asia. So that's point number one. Now, if you have to devise your innovations, then probably you'll have to sidetrack. And I keep saying this, I would say that we actually don't need a lot of innovations within the financing. What we need is real finance. Because this part of the world is completely vulnerable and is, in a way, is also very aspirational because we are leapfrogging into from an emerging economy to a developing economy. And that's from a developing economy to a emerging economy, and that's where our economical aspirations need to be supported. Now, in order to support that, what we need real innovation is innovation in terms of system, innovation in terms of technology, which is backed by sufficient finance. And that finance needs to come down from a blending. It can't just be public investment. It can't be just private investment. It can't be just venture capitalists coming down or angel funders coming down to fund them. What we need is actually a conglomeration of all of this so that some of the homegrown, local-led innovations can actually be boosted. And as Maheen rightly said, that some of these innovations are kind of risk averse. They are not bankable. The more important point is that how do we make them bankable? We have been running one of the largest, I would say, blended finance facility in India for the healthcare sector. And we started, which has been supported by USAID, and we call it as Samrit. And that blended finance facility has been able to mobilize more than 300 million US dollars. What we have been able to do is, actually within the health sector, is we support more than 100 kind of now startups, innovations. What we have done or what we have been able to do is we have been able to nudge them. And nudging them, of course, for the health sector, but now we are trying to understand how the health sector innovations can actually have can play at the interplay of climate and health. And similarly, we need hardcore kind of innovations that supports climate mitigation activities, climate adaptation activities, and more importantly, those innovations that are at the interplay of climate risk, climate adaptation and mitigation. Now, again, Carlos touched upon the Latin American context. One of the important things is A, to have an innovation, B, to finance them, but see how that innovation is panning out. And many of our innovations, and Maheen, if I'm not wrong, you are primarily into supporting infrastructural financing, then many a times some of these infrastructures backfire. That is what in IPCC's term we call it as maladaptation. So we have to be very cognizant of what kind of innovation are we going to support. What is the long-term life cycle assessment? What is the implication in kind of 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, because any infrastructural project you finance, it doesn't have a 5-year or 20-year time span. It has to be spanning across 35 to 50 and more, even more. So in terms of, again, coming back to numbers, if we look at low emission scenario, then there are already estimates that if we are in a low emission scenario, which is RCP 2.5, typically from a IPCC framework, then we are going to lose around 350 billion euros every year. That's huge, right? And then if, within the midterm emission scenario, which is RCP 4.5, which roughly we are tending kind of as a world, trying to reach that RCP 4.5 scenario, then we are going to lose almost 600 billion euros. And more importantly, the high emission scenario by 2100, which we are going to kind of bridge, then we are going to look at a risk of more than 900 billion euros. And these numbers are stark reminders. So what do we do? Of course, I don't want to be sounding as an alarmist, but what I'm saying is that with every issue or problem that we identify, we need to understand how the risk is. And rather than looking at the risk from a blinkered approach, we need to look at what are the cascading compounding impacts. Now, let me give you one implication of how does climate risk impacts are. If there is a cyclone, then you have to get yourself prepared for coastal flooding or for a flash flooding or for a coastal inundation. And at the same time, once you have a flooding and once you have a cyclone on top of it, then there are health implications as well. Number one, there are livelihood implications as well. There are infrastructures which do not cannot withstand it. Your power sector has been paralyzed because you don't have a sustained power supply. Hence, your manufacturing sector is going to be impacted. Similarly, if we just look at numbers from the heat wave, then heat stress has got a health impact. But what impact it has on GDP is like there are estimates that India is going to lose more than 4.5% of its GDP only because of heat wave. Now, do we have a financing mechanism to make these sectors, especially those sectors which are very, very climate kind of sensitive to heat waves, risk averse? Do we have it? So these are some of the misconceptions that we need to burst today. And in order to burst them, we need to understand that what is the big elephant in the room, rather than just saying, oh yes, climate change is there. Oh yes, the innovations are kind of supporting climate mitigation or adaptation. We need to go beyond that. We need to understand if it is, then how do we stop it? At least, if not stop it, how do we halt it, and halt it in a green, clean, and more sustainable way? I'll stop there, Pablo.
Thank you, Abinash. And we are able to understand you, but the sound is a little bit like it's not. I'm not sure if it's background noise or something. But if you could perhaps just check the microphone or change the volume of the microphone would be great. But some excellent comments there, and I think I would like to pick up on this idea of maladaptation, but also capacity building and partnerships, because like I think it's fair to assume is that often it's the people who are on the ground that have lived in an area for generations who are best able to judge what the impacts of certain projects might be, and to the degree to which that then they're engaged with or able to partner with local businesses to be able to deliver those projects can be a useful form of risk mitigation, if you like, in terms of maladaptive projects. And Carlos, you mentioned in your earlier comments as well, in terms of some of the investment being seen as a cost and the cultural barriers that come in as well. So being seen as a cost rather than investment, and the cultural barriers. So like, could you reflect a little bit on this idea of what are the ways in which you can build relationships in order to try and prevent some of those maladaptive issues from arising in the first place?
Yes, well, I think it's a very important aspect. I think also Maheen was mentioning this on how we are creating that capacity building that we need to already have. And that comes, at least in the Latin American region, it comes a lot from not being prepared to being able to offer those minimum requirements of the projects that are not finding their financing nor finding their place into the overall arena. And the reason for this is that sometimes there's a lot of training that's lacking from the companies and from the productive sector in order to understand what the financiers are looking for into these projects. In a way, it's as simple as trying to understand that we need to speak the same language. We need to understand the same criteria. We have to understand risk at the same proportion as the financier is understanding it. But sometimes it's challenging. It does require cultural change, and it does require training, and it's frictional. It does take some time, and it does take a lot of effort to change that. It's trying to finding a way to see the big picture, if we may. We try to make so that those companies understand that overall there's going to be a much more benefit into trying to align to other standards and criteria, to be more eco-friendly, to be more aligned socially to the projects that they have. Overall, we'll end up paying more, but we also need to see it not only thinking short term, but actually trying to see how it can be reflected on the long run. This part is obviously challenging. It's changing the way people already operate, and in many cases the way they operate already successfully. But it's actually seeing a potential, a very big potential that it's out there, and they could be getting more access to resources, into standardizing processes, for example, into being more aligned to certain ambitions and goals that will eventually be required also legally, as we have seen in different regions. But in the case of Latin America, it's just taking a little bit longer because of the ambiguity and some other complications that we have with regulation in the region. But it's part of a very interesting dynamic into how we make that connection in between the financiers and the companies. The other thing that I also find very, very interesting, and I guess it's a good example of how this sometimes is misconnected, is exchange rate risk, for example. A lot of local companies in many countries in Latin America prefer to issue debt whenever they issue debt in local currencies. And in a way, for a lot of foreign investment, of course, if there was a possibility to invest in more well-recognized currencies, US dollar, euro, etc., it would obviously be more intuitive and more easy for them to access those kinds of investments. But in a way, trying to convince the local companies to understand that it's part of what can be designed in the overall product that they're issuing. It's still culturally challenging, and it does take maturity of the market also to evolve into understanding better how even that can be also offset, if necessary, the risk for exchange rate, etc. But it's still a market that it's understanding those opportunities, and it's trying to advance on that regard. I would say perhaps more education and more understanding of the actual potential and all those burdens and complications that exist could be helping. But it really it's not only about learning the technicalities, it's also about educating ourselves into understanding that interesting potential.
Great, thank you. And I will turn to Maheen now, Carlos, just because I think when we spoke ahead of this event, Maheen, you were explaining to me your gender bond, which is innovative, one of the first of its kind. And I think it actually exemplifies a lot of the qualities that that Carlos and Abinash actually talked about in terms of that capacity building factor, the importance of finding local partners, of taking the time to learn and understand those impacts and how you can then start to bring that together. So please tell us that story about the gender bond that you've just recently been involved with.
Sure. So this was almost a year-long process, I think, to get to the stage where we could actually talk about issuing this gender bond. So as a foreign investor, what was our primary aim? So we needed to find a partner locally who was able to carry forward our own thought process in terms of impact finance and do something innovative as well, and make it more sort of market relevant and particularly capital market relevant. Now, the way we sort of went about doing that was looking at people who had a long and rich history of doing impact, but perhaps not in the global sense of working that impact. So we came across a local non-government organization. It was also a non-banking company by the name of Kash Foundation, who had been working in Pakistan for about 27 years, doing microfinance lending to predominantly what was largely a female clientele. And a lot of them were low-income women working in the rural sector, and very small loans to kind of help them with working capital and their own businesses and so on and so forth. So we partnered with Kash because we really believed in their story and their ability to carry forward their own credit processes through their own learning, and they had really come up with a very nice institution. And so when we started discussing this with them, we said, is there something we can do in the capital market? And I think the main pushback that we got from them was, well, our credit rating is not where the capital market would like it to be, and hence we are not at that stage where we can attract sort of the really big money, such as pension funds or mutual funds, etc., because our credit rating is just simply not there. So what we did is effectively to cut a long story short, we've now signed on with them to do a gender bond, which is going to be 100% fully guaranteed by Infrazamin. And so the bond actually takes on our own credit rating, which is AAA in Pakistan, and backed by Guaranco, which is AA- by Moody's internationally. And so their credit rating now is effectively even slightly higher than the sovereign rating of Pakistan itself. And so we've taken this bond to the actual capital market, kept it completely 100% commercial. It carries a commercial rate of interest, and the proceeds of that bond will go to Kash Foundation to lend towards developing micro infrastructure for women in rural areas. And we'll do that by lending towards house reconstruction or business rehabilitation, or even building, for example, new schools, etc., in those areas. And because the lending is 100% towards women, it does meet the UN sort of principles of a gender bond and hitting the targets in terms of SDG 5. And so we've only kind of been able to do this because we had a partner that we found we really had to look for that was engaged in a similar work, and we just simply opened the door to additional financing for them. And the interesting thing in sort of all these sort of innovative financial techniques that you see is you don't need a significant amount of money to make a large impact. I mean, this bond is about 2.5 billion rupees, is just shy of, I would say, about $10 million for Pakistan, but it will impact 30,000 women in rural areas. And if we consider that from the perspective of 30,000 families, then we're looking at a range of anywhere of 150 to 200,000 people that we will have impacted through lending. And it's done in an entirely commercial format without the need for any kind of subsidies, etc. So I think more and more we need to see these kind of structures coming through, which will sort of crowd in private capital. And to lift from Carlos's point, yes, absolutely. I think we've all seen what has happened with emerging market currencies over the last couple of years with US dollar strength. So there's a lot of reticence in terms of borrowing in dollars. And more and more the shift is now, how can we do this in local currency? How can we crowd in local private sector? without the need for sort of expensive US dollar denominated or foreign currency denominated borrowing. And that makes it much more sustainable, especially when you consider it over 10 or 15 years, right? So that's the kind of work that we're trying to do here. And yes, it is due to launch soon, this gender bond, and hopefully another couple of months we close it off. And it will be the first one out of Pakistan. I think it will also be the first one out of South Asia. So we're quite excited about that development. And again, we just want to continue to partner with local organizations that carry that sort of credible marker for us, where we can partner with them over the next 10 to 15 years and come up with even more solutions. So, we're thinking about water bonds, we're thinking about green bonds to be, done locally. We have done green bonds internationally, but I think using the local markets would be better. And I think what you see here is that you must be able to replicate such transactions. They can't be absolutely impossible, to ever do again, because then you will never build that scale. So our aim is to keep it simple, keep the structuring straightforward, and as the market evolves, we are able to see more and more sort of those local pools of capital come in, rather than the constant reliance on sort of international funding.
Thank you. And it's such a wonderful example, because both, I think, from that capacity building and education aspect, by having you partner with local businesses that are doing the work, one, it helps you from a risk kind of understanding and assessment perspective, because you have that insight and that knowledge from businesses that are on the ground, but it's also obviously helping them in their capacity building and their ability to then tap external capital to be able to grow their impact. And so it's a really practical and profound way that you're not only able to bring capital to bear in such an important area, but also to help build capacity for future to do that again. And I also like connect it back to what Carlos was saying earlier around seeing the bigger picture, because we know the extraordinary impact that empowering women has in so many contexts, from a social, from an environmental context. And so being able to step back and look at it from that perspective, I think is really powerful as well. So thank you for that example. Roger Spiller has just asked, which I think is great, like we'd love to hear other examples of that, because I think those practical examples are really important. Abinash, I might turn to you and then to Carlos around, have you seen innovative financing structures, or particularly those things that help to build capacity, direct capital to where it's most needed, but using that local knowledge and using that perspective?
Yes, one very interesting example that I can mention in Mexico is for coffee production, having a cooperative of coffee producers being sponsored by one of their main clients directly, and trying to bridge a little bit of a very complex supply chain that exists with coffee in different locations. In the case of that particular implementation, shortening that a part of the middle person in between the farmer and the actual consumer of coffee allowed for a very, very interesting implementation of the financing of the plants that the farmers were growing, because those plants were not pest resistant, they were not as productive as they should have, and they were also not getting a lot of support from the government, because they were in a very remote area, very close to the border with Guatemala and Mexico. So it was not really the kind of area that politicians will go and support and even visit sometimes. That kind of implementation, it's a very, very interesting one, because it actually has a very interesting outcomes. On one side, the farmers actually get the opportunity to have other channels to sell their product directly. They can sell the coffee directly to the company that it's sponsoring the project, because it's a direct investment in that way. But if they find actually another taker on the market that is willing to pay a better price, they're also able to sell it to whomever it's making them a better offer. On the other side, it's also helping change a lot of the cultural issues that we were also mentioning, because in those particular rural areas in Mexico, there's a lot of very sad situations of child labor, for example, or very, very complicated situations on the kind of conditions that the actual family that owns the farm are having for their own family members on how they work, etc. But as the project helped increase production, in that particular case, in between 500 to 800% more production of coffee just by changing the variety of plants that they were growing. It actually helped that they actually would understand those better conditions and adapt to that, so that they could culturally adapt as well, and allow, well, for the children in the community to go to school on regular hours, and all those included in the Declaration of Human Rights and the rights of children, which it's great, but it wouldn't have been possible unless the practicalities of actually having a more stable and more interesting way to improve their productivity would result from. All of this just to say that the complication in this particular project was precisely what we were mentioned already, which is initial cost. In the case of these communities, it is not that they don't understand they could be growing a better variety of coffee. It is not that they don't understand that they could be selling their coffee to someone else. It is not that they don't know that there could be better conditions for what they do. The problem is it costs a lot initially. And sometimes having those couple $1,000, it's not even that much in general, but having that as a family that owns a farm and that's their only source of income, it's very complicated. So just making a structure that supports so that they can have that initial investment to be paid over time on a reasonable way that they can actually afford, based on the fact that they will be productive. It's actually a very productive endeavor. It is just the timing that it's not helping them. It's the kind of example as well that I think it also helps to have a very positive social. And I didn't mention the environmental part, but the kind of conditions these communities have anyway, they grow their coffee organic. But yet again, they do it intuitively because they don't have access to chemicals or to other things to put in coffee. They wouldn't, because they don't even have the resources for that. But yet again, they cannot sell their coffee as organic because they need to get certified. And getting certified also, it's another barrier that can be easily overcome as soon as they can get some financing for that. So that's part as well of the solution.
Great. No, thank you. That's a great example. And Abinash, just before I come to you, I just wanted to touch on it because I think it's a from an investment or an investor standpoint, that's a wonderful example that investors can have an impact, not just through direct financing, through debt instruments, as Maheen was talking about, but through our engagement with companies, because by ensuring that companies at the consumer goods, I think 27% of Nestle's revenues are linked to coffee. So this is a material issue for them. In terms of the sustainability of their supply chains and for many other consumer goods companies. And so that type of positive engagement really have them to reach through the supply chain and connect with the smallholder farmers and build at a landscape and community level, as opposed to just thinking about production is really powerful. So Abinash, we'd love to hear positive examples from you as well in terms of interventions that you found have been really effective in bringing finance in, but also having that positive social impact.
Yeah, so when we say any investment, we need to look at two factors. How is it going to improve the livelihood, and more importantly, our economic sectors that are kind of grappling with the
larger landscape of climate risk, which is impacting them by large, right? Their processes, their systems, and their infrastructures by large. I'll pick up a very classic example because urbanization is kind of a buzzword, and a lot of our geographies are kind of trying to urbanize themselves. There is an aspiration to be urbanized. So how do we, because I have been talking about the adaptation mitigation co-benefits that we talk of, Carlo's example, Maheen example, are kind of trying to be very inclusive, trying to be convergent. So India is kind of recently going to get its foot at the door in terms of voluntary carbon markets. And at the city level, some municipal bonds have been created, and those municipal bonds have been kind of trying to fix the seasonal landscapes because they were disrupted completely. And through nature-based solutions, they have been kind of fixed. And while they have been fixed, cities like Indore in India and the Greater Chennai region also have been able to generate more than $5 million. And that money, what it has been able to do is kind of bringing about that investment in terms of making the local lives and livelihoods more, provide them an alternative livelihood, right? They have to maintain some of these nature-based solutions which have been implemented. Some of the nature-based solutions are biodike implementation, bamboo grass, coastal erosion check. Then in terms of fixing the microclimate, the larger tree cover, which has been by medicinal plants. So what it has also done is it has also provided a supply to our larger Ayush industry or the Ayurveda industry that we call it as, right? The raw material actually comes down from this ecosystem. And these ecosystem services are kind of been boosted. A, B, they have been able to provide alternative livelihoods. C, they have also generated a lot of money, not just for to public interventions, but also to the private interventions. And what has been done is the private kind of investments that have come in have made these communities, local communities, to build them up. And that's one. The second example is, again, from an infrastructure climate proofing. So IP Global implemented FCDO supported project, what we call it as ICRG, Inclusive Climate Resilient Growth. And in that project, we tried, so Manrega is one of the larger livelihood kind of schemes in South Asia and probably in the world because it provides livelihood, earnings, minimum wages. Those are kind of the contours. But it also has a contour of building infrastructures at a localized level through public investment that can provide alternative livelihood, and also can provide climate resilience to the communities. And we have up and running more than 8,000 structures where rejuvenation of lakes, ponds, in terms of integrated farming, all of them have kind of supported through, again, a financing which was publicly heavy. 80% of the money came in from the public investment, but 20% came in from supporting those innovations who can be part of the Manrega. So at a micro level also you can make these changes in terms of through sustainable financing, then it can build resilient community structures, we provide alternate livelihoods, and more importantly, it can also provide larger resilience to the evolving risk landscape. The third example that I'll take is from a very, very sophisticated, because as we are becoming aspirational to become urbanized, as we are becoming aspirational to stay into urban hamlets, our economic aspirations are also increasing, so as our food habits are increasing. And since our food habits are increasing, a lot of these native fruits and vegetables like the broccoli, so on and so forth, are not invested to India, right? At least to the northern and central part. So there have been controlled kind of atmospheres which have been built in by the local communities, local farmers who were grappling with the sustenance or the kind of primary crops, right? And now they have a market not just in India or across South Asia, but a lot of these have been sent out to Australia and other Latin American countries because the quality and the kind of quantity that has been produced is actually cost effective. And so these are some of the circular economy models which are in place, but we are just getting started. We just don't need a lot more of innovations. There are many innovations. We need to capitalize on them, and we need to scale these innovations. We need to make them scalable. More importantly, make them affordable, available, and accessible, and basically putting the money where the mouth is rather than just spreading it all over.
Right. No, thank you very much. And I think that, again, an example that goes to a couple of the questions that we actually have in the chat, which I want to turn to now. We have about 9 minutes to go in the session. And so there's two slightly separate questions, but I'll ask you to just pick up on the piece that you're most comfortable and interested in talking about. One is what I've been calling the diseconomies of scale. And I think we've heard a number of times over the course of this discussion, and this is to Gillian's question, that relatively small scale investments, in the thousands of dollars, hundreds of dollars, sometimes less, but yet you've got these huge scale institutional investors who need big ticket sizes in order to write checks. And then there's obviously a need for intermediation then in between to bring those two together, or to find the right type of, Maheen talked about finding the right type of investor. And so it would be wonderful to hear your thoughts on that. And then the other one, which I think goes to Carlos's point earlier around the certification of coffee, is having to prove impact a barrier for a lot of these investments, because clearly we spend a lot of time thinking about measurable outcomes, and that requires effort and additional resource to deliver. And so, and particularly when you're talking about these integrated solutions, say at the community level, as you were talking about with the coffee, Carlos, or Abinash, you're talking at the community level impacts, they're even harder to prove because they're integrated and interconnected. And so, so just those two questions: is trying to prove impact a barrier, and other alternatives, and secondly, diseconomies of scale. How do we bridge the gap between large institutional investors and these sort of smaller scale projects? I'll start with Maheen, please.
Sure. So look, on the investor side, if we look at where the bulk of the money is today globally, I would say most investors are very agnostic towards sustainable financing. They will make an investment based on commercial decisions, based on what the shareholder return is expected, based on those very standard metrics that we have in finance. I think and it's very difficult usually to change the mind of investors and convince them that they should now be pushing bigger allocations towards sustainable finance. I think one way to effect scale, which has been done actually within industry itself. And if you have industry, for example, if we pick up an exporting industry, and you can pick up anyone, say textiles or sportswear, or whatever, they are large consumers of natural resource. They're large consumers of water. They're large consumers of labor. And what we have seen slowly is the transition where because they're exporters, as an industry, they need to now comply to a lot of international standards, and that's the case everywhere. So I think with that push, if we actually use industry as a better benchmark to scale better practices, and coming back to your question on when is impact enough, I think there's multiple ways of measuring impact. I don't think anyone has an absolutely perfect way to do it. But if we are meeting some broad objectives of reducing sort of negative impact on environment, or cutting carbon emissions, or using better sources of fuel, or even empowering labor to be more sort of less focused around the child labor issues, etc., then those are kind of impactful enough in a lot of emerging markets. And I think if we become too specific about what constitutes impact, we're going to miss a lot of the large-scale impact that we can have very quickly. So I think if we use industry as a benchmark, and where industry is kind of forced into complying with various standards, that's one good example of scaling. And transition that into industry which is more focused on local markets, and pushing them to also adopt measures. And they can be smaller measures. Some of them will do it just because economically it makes sense to. But sometimes you just need a general push from an industry association regulation. And that can really change the way an individual company is thinking about its own impact, excuse me, as within a larger industry. And I think so building scale through private sector operators, through partners, using industry to set benchmarks, which later on then is something that they can talk about with their investors. But remember, there's always going to be that sort of disconnect because investors are looking for quick returns, shareholder value, share prices. And on the other side, you have industry trying to build in long-term sort of sustainable solutions into their processes. So it's going to be one of those learning points where industry, takes a step forward, and then so do institutional investors. I don't think it's something that's going to happen overnight, but as we see more and more industry scale towards better practices, I think that understanding among investors and that acceptance among general mainstream investors, not just impact investors, will hold that, will begin to slowly filter through. The other point I want to touch upon in scale is one is obviously you've got industry working and you've got those actors. But on the other side, you also have governments and regulation. And there's a fair amount of that, I think, in the developed world, especially in certain countries, but in the emerging markets and in developing countries, it is a challenge to kind of convince a government, which is usually battling a number of social issues and not to mention fiscal issues and so on and so forth, to begin to focus on climate or to begin to focus on other areas. But I think we can't rule out that type of regulation which pushes financial institutions or even other investors to have allocations towards green finance and chase those projects as well. I know in Pakistan, the State Bank of Pakistan has green financing, but has not yet made it mandatory for banks to allocate a certain percentage of their lending towards those projects. So, those are the kind of steps that you need to take to really build kind of effective scale. And I do believe they have to be, one, coming from the top, and secondly, as much industry scale as you can reach. I think that's when you really begin to see, more of that filter through into sort of everyday life, as opposed to just the one-off project that you're going to see here and there. Okay.
Right. No, thank you. Love that. And I love the idea of impactful enough. Let's all look for that. And just with a few minutes to go, maybe a minute for and a bit for Carlos and for Abinash with final comments. Abinash, can I start with you, please?
Thank you, Pablo. And I think we have tried to manage well in terms of touching the multifacets of sustainable financing, trying to encapsulate some of the growing and picking up conversations around the misconceptions. But what is more important is to understand that when we are talking of public, private, or blending, or trying to mainstream or bring climate actions, or at least socio-economic and climate actions converge together from margins to mainstream, one of the important factors is money is required. And in order to get that money, there are different people, different kind of mandates which are available, because government has got a larger beneficiary mandate. Similarly, the private investors have also got a profit margin to look into. So it can be charity. And how do we blame that ideological paradigm in terms of the larger common good? It's something we have to come up, right? Sometimes it can be enforcement, sometimes it can be the certain market, sometimes the opportunities. But at the crux of it is we have a climate which has already been changed, needs to be fought on, head-on kind of thing. And second is we need homegrown, local-led, and more importantly, there has to be a innovation which is not just innovative or kind of scalable, but is local and homegrown. And more importantly, you need to transfer that. If there is a best practice that Carlos is talking of, my coffee producers in the country need not need to start looking for more innovation if they are similar or convergent, right? We need to have that mechanism of transferring it. Similarly, the innovations those have been coming up within India can be scaled, or within the South Asia larger can be scaled across Africa. And similarly, the innovation transfer needs to happen. And more importantly, how does innovation have been able to foster investment is the billion-dollar question. And if you can scale not just the innovation, but also the financial mechanisms, I think the world is not a bad place to live in.
Great. Thank you, Abinash. Appreciate that. Carlos, please, final word for you, and then we'll close.
Well, yes, I think regarding the question specifically about the additional barrier for certifications, yes, definitely. And especially for smallholder farmers, for example, it is a barrier sometimes that they cannot get certified. However, it is also an opportunity in the case of some of these certifications, specifically for coffee and other food products. It is also beneficial for the farmers because sometimes they can also cash on that and have a price premium in the product that they're selling. The complication here is that sometimes it is complex with the kind of supply chains that we have with this kind of activity. In the case of coffee, there's no less than 7 to 11 different steps in the middle person chain that we have in between the farmer and the end consumer. So having that very complex connection in between intermediaries that eventually get their take on that product, for the actual farmer, unless they have control on the product that they're selling and who's going to be buying it directly, there's no way they can actually profit from investing, for example, on certification. So it's kind of a two-sided problem in that regard, that it is, yes, costly, but sometimes it's difficult to bank on it, and it's a problem. I was also going to mention that specific case on coffee, we have it published. I shared that on the chat with the link that's available publicly, but I will also try to share it with Pablo and Mariana in case anybody's interested. I'm not sure how the copyright works with that regard to post it on Altiorem, but we can figure out perhaps.
Great. No, thank you, Carlos. As a public library, we have certain privileges in relation to copyright, in that we can house a lot of things which are copyright. I just want to thank you, all three of you, for your amazing insights. It's been fantastic. Pleased to those of you who've been able to remain on the thing. This is just like a tasting plate. This is not the end of this discussion. We obviously need to have many more discussions like this, and we hope to play a role in bringing those discussions to you. We'll certainly be focusing on how do we build out the library to bring these voices to the forefront for sustainable finance, and also, as I mentioned at the beginning, incredibly important Indigenous voices as well in developed countries. We need to be hearing a lot more from them also. So with ending just slightly late, we're grateful for you spending some of your Friday afternoon with us, and please engage with us. Please let us know what you're interested in hearing more about, and we'd love to be able to put it on. Thank you again, Carlos, Abinash, and Maheen, for your time and your insights. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you.